raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages audio journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, where our search for answers about the past may take us to obscure and at times even unsettling areas. Joining me as always are my friends and cohorts on this 4th of July holiday, James Waldo and Jason Pintrail. I hear you're getting settled down there a little further south. Jason, how you doing?
Hey, I don't know if settled is the right word, but we're definitely making some progress, doing house renovations, painting, removing popcorn ceilings. I don't know if you guys have ever done that, but it's not fun, which is why after a brief stint in that direction, I just hired somebody else to do it. Guy did a great job. It looks much better. And if you're wondering, the asbestos test did come back negative. So,
well, that is certainly good news, especially when moving into a new domicile. Also, as always, from the great state of Arkansas, James Waldo, how are you? 45 words or less.
Good.
That works too.
So, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. And I feel your pain on that, Jason. We bought this house in November when we moved back up to the Little Rock area. And, it's a process, man. We're still not completely settled in. I've got boxes with stuff in them. Danielle was going through some stuff yesterday, and she's like, oh, here's our taxes from the last 2 years. And it was just in some random box that was in the bedroom that just, like these boxes will sort of, you just get used to them in there. And then it becomes sort of this thing. They just become part of the decor.
Oh, yeah. You've got a table set up on this one. You got a plant set up on that one. You've got a bunch of books laid out on top of this one. And it's just kind of part of the environment. They have a unique sort of aesthetic, don't they?
It does. It's cardboard chic, I think.
The boxes that are always most interesting to me is the one that you end up at the end of the move. You just have a bunch of miscellaneous things and you put it in one box and you mark it miscellaneous things. And at the time you go, I'll remember what's in here later. And then 2 months later, you have no clue. Hey, where did that one thing go? I don't know. Let's go look in the miscellaneous boxes. And you're like, oh, it's like a treasure hunt. You're like, oh, look at this. Oh, that's where that went.
Yeah.
So we tried to cut down on that this time, but man, I had 4 days to pack the whole entire house. And when you have to move that quick, you definitely end up with a good collection of miscellaneous boxes.
Yeah. And you were talking about your popcorn ceilings. We talked about this the other day, and the first thing I said was like, hey, I hope you got an asbestos test on that. And you did. But what I was going to say is, for those that don't know, I worked in as an environmental consultant for years, almost 20 years. And a big part of that work is asbestos work, asbestos sampling, inspections, and then, managing abatement projects and all of that kind of stuff. And the lab that the company I used to work for, they were the only accredited asbestos lab in the state of Arkansas. And I started out in the lab just analyzing asbestos samples under a microscope. I did that. I rode that chair for a long time. So, I've got a lot of experience in that, and I'm not willing to go back into that industry anymore. I'm glad I don't do that.
He's got years of experience and no doubt a lot of stories about that, which unfortunately we've got to save for another time because,
that's right.
Researchers have recently found and confirmed an Aboriginal archaeological site. Actually, I believe it's a complex of sites off the coast of Australia, and that they think that there will indeed be more. This has been something we've been looking at for a long time here on this show, the way that we will be able to detect underwater archaeological sites in the future. And CNN reporting here that many settlements were built in areas that were not dry land at the end of the last ice age when sea levels were lower, but were submerged as the sea rose. This according to a study published Wednesday in the journal PLOS ONE. The Australian coast extended 100 miles farther out to sea than it does now, and the team of researchers led by archaeologist Jonathan Benjamin of the Flinders University in Adelaide, are saying that it is very likely that they're going to find a lot more sites out there off the Australian coast. But the same could be said here about North America and the number of sites that are located off of the coastal waters here stateside, because often when we speak with our friends in archaeology, they're interested in how new technologies, drones and autonomous aqueous vehicles and the like, and of course, good old-fashioned dive teams are going to be able to use leading-edge archaeological practices to discern things about the past which have been kept under cover of water now for thousands of years.
Yeah, first thing I thought of was Doggerland.
Right.
But on the U.S. East Coast, or the East Coast of North America, really, for the most part, the coastal plain, the submerged part of that goes out way 50 miles out, further than what people think. So there's untold amounts of undiscovered things out there off the East Coast.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if we think about the fact that, throughout history, the resources that are available along shorelines are going to be exploited by people. When the Ice Age, of course, when we were at the peak of the Pleistocene and sea levels were lower, people were further out there off the coast, and so those archaeological sites now underwater probably have untold secrets, and there are all kinds of things that we will hope to find in the next few years. So it's not just Australia. Really, anywhere around the world, we can learn a lot about the last geological epoch from looking at what's out there underwater. I'll tell you, another way you can learn an awful lot about the various periods going back several thousands of years into our past is by studying the artifacts left by those people. And Jason, of course, as you well know, and so do you, James, Occoquan Paleotechnics, LLC, our friends there bring archaeology to life in the very most real sense with their replicas. Jason, have you got anything particularly that you're looking at that Occoquan has been producing lately?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it seems like on a very regular basis now, they're getting out lots of new material. This week, this episode is no exception. This time we have a masterfully casted Paleolithic hand axe. Now, these are artifacts that are often discussed when we're talking old world civilizations. These are extremely old, very prehistoric types of hand axes. This particular cast that we're going to talk about this week, this is an old world African hand axe. And this was collected in Ethiopia. It was generously loaned to OCC Paleo from the Richard Grawl collection. It was allowed to be molded and casted. And the idea is that collectors and teachers and institutions can, obviously benefit from this type of example. This is one of the earliest stone tools in prehistory. This particular hand axe is the longest running and oldest stone type known throughout the world. So when we say it's really at the beginning of this type of production, it truly is. The examples from Ethiopia could possibly be some of the very earliest that we know of. So this is something, has a study piece that would be great for classrooms, great for personal collectors, anybody who's interested in the earliest type of technologies. Again, this one is masterfully casted. It's an exact replica of the piece that was generously loaned to OCC Paleo for casting and molding. It is available now. And I want to take a moment to remind all of the listeners that, again, OCCPaleo.com has given a very generous 20% discount for 7 Ages listeners. So anything that you want to purchase from the store at checkout, just enter the promo code 7 Ages. That's the number 7, AGES in all caps at checkout to receive that very generous 20% discount off of your total order, exclusive for 7 Ages listeners. Also want to take a moment to remind any other businesses out there, if you're interested in advertising on the 7 Ages Audio Journal podcast, please contact me, and that is Jason at 7ages.org, and I'll be happy to send you some of our prices, and we can discuss the type of advertising that you'd want to do.
Yeah, we're very proud to offer a platform for people, and archaeological enthusiasts, of course, are our specialty. So thanks for your support, Occoquan Paleotechnics. Also, I want to thank a few people out there who continue to support this program. A new donation of $15 came in from Edith Wacker, who is a new listener. So thank you, Edith. We appreciate your support. Of course, ongoing support from George Howard, Christina Frawley, and a few others who have continued to show support for this program. If you'd like to do the same, all you got to do is head on over to 7ages.org. You can send a donation in any amount by clicking the donate button right there on the right-hand side of the page. We offer a lot of content, and of course, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and so that's one way that you can show support, not only for the content and the work that goes into it, but also just to show that you enjoy what we do. Although there are many ways that can be done, do consider, please, leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. I think, guys, that we got our first 1-star review recently. In fact, I think it had been someone who'd left a 3-star review and was so angry they had to go back and change it to a 1-star.
Yeah, that is the case. We were on a really good 2-year plus high review. We'd received nothing but almost 5-star reviews for that entire time. What's most interesting about this newest 1-star review that we have received is it wasn't about the content of the show. Of the basically 90 minutes that we put out per episode, it seemed that the reviewer was happy with 89 of those minutes.
I see.
It happened to be our theme song that just apparently drove this person to leave a 1-star review because he thought the music was so terrible.
So you don't like my singing, do ya? Well, hey, you know what?
Hey, so, to each his own.
My question, though, for folks who would complain about the music and leave a 1-star review is, did you happen to catch the other 77 minutes of the podcast, with all of the information, with all of the interviews with archaeologists who, frankly, either often don't or simply aren't able to appear and devote their time to interviews of the length and scope that we offer on the show? And again, there's no bitterness on our part, but we just want to remind you that if the music is your main complaint, I hope that you're catching the other 77 minutes on every episode that we offer, which is, I think it's fair to say, unlike any other podcast that deals with this topic. We're very proud to be able to offer this platform. And if you enjoy the interviews that we feature, hey, we don't want to tell you how many stars to leave, but do consider leaving a review. Those reviews make the world go round. And of course, you can also follow us on all the social media platforms out there. Twitter, we are on Instagram, we are on Facebook, and we are always happy to hear from you. And of course, if you'd like to reach out directly to one of us, as Jason had mentioned there are emails which you can use to do that. Micah or Jason or James at 7ages, the words 7ages.org. So we'd love to hear from you. Someone else we were really happy to hear from and had the opportunity to speak with recently was Dr. Bettina Arnold, who was our guest this week and who we'll be speaking with when we come back after this. She has been for decades involved in the study of socio-political history of archaeology and also museum collecting, especially the involvement in identity construction in the 19th and 20th century nationalist and ethnic movements in Europe and in the United States and how those relate to this. But Dr. Bettina Arnold, I think, is one of those very important archaeologists because she is looking at the archaeological side of more recent history. And yes, this does have to do with the rise of the Third Reich during the Second World War. And I think, as the old adage says, we study the past so that we know the mistakes of the past and that in the future we won't make the same mistakes. And I think that when we study times like World War II, the world on the brink, it is so important to remember that that kind of thing could happen again. And so the work of archaeologists like Dr. Arnold are so very important, and the work she's done over the years is also very interesting to explore and discuss with her. So she will join us next when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. What a conversation we have lined up today. Bettina Arnold obtained her BA in archaeology from Yale University and her MA and PhD degrees in anthropology from Harvard University. She is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she served as the co-director of the Center for Celtic Studies from 2000 to 2009 and coordinator of the Museum Studies graduate program from 1996 to 2012. Her area of expertise is in the pre-Roman European Iron Age. But in the course of her career, she has participated in archaeological projects ranging from the Middle Bronze Age through the early medieval period in Western Europe. And since 1999, she has co-directed the Landscape of Ancestors research project in southwest Germany, focused on the burial record of the early Iron Age Heuneburg, hillfort, and its environs. Now, among other projects, she has been involved in the study of socio-political history of archaeology and museum collecting, especially the involvement of this in identity construction in 19th and 20th century nationalist and ethnic movements in Europe and the United States. And so first, allow me just to say what a pleasure it is to have you here to talk with us, as I feel that your work is both as an archaeologist and the historical side of it, it's unique and also very important right now.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
Professor Arnold, you wrote what is often referred to as a groundbreaking article in 1990, which appeared in the journal Antiquity. That paper, titled "The Past as Propaganda, Totalitarian Archaeology in Nazi Germany," looked at the abuse of archaeology for political purposes. And due to the crucial perspectives that it offered on this period in history, it has been reprinted repeatedly. Leading up to that, your academic work has focused in part on the socio-political history of archaeology, museum collecting, so many other aspects that we've already touched on. Would you mind giving us a bit of your insight into the dynamics of these factors and the movements that your work has focused on over the last several decades?
Sure. I think the most important thing to kind of emphasize is the fact that you could argue that the archaeological and historical records serve the same purpose for societies that memory in general does for individuals. And, obviously, if there's a loss of memory, the individual is no longer capable of functioning normally, and the same thing is true for societies. And equally, I would say that there's an ability for human beings to sort of selectively erase certain memories that they're not necessarily all that comfortable with, or which they, potentially see as putting them in not such a terrific light. Societies do the same thing as well. And I think one of the roles of archaeologists and historians then is to serve as a kind of memory bank for society as a whole. And so from my own perspective, I guess, in terms of how I got interested in this subject, it's largely due actually to a seminar that I took when I was in graduate school. We had a visiting professor of archaeology from Australia, often actually referred to as the father of Australian archaeology, John Mulvaney, now unfortunately no longer with us. And he taught a seminar entitled "Who Owns the Past?" And that was what started me on this path, because I was already working in Germany doing prehistoric archaeology. But I got interested in what I assumed was going to be a very easy topic to research, which related to that particular seminar topic, and that was the question of how the National Socialist regime either made use of or in various ways manipulated the archaeological evidence that presumably was coming out of excavations at the time. And I guess somewhat naively, I assumed there would be all kinds of secondary source material, and discovered very quickly that in fact there was exactly one article in English that had been written by someone who was mainly focusing on the influence of Gustav Kossina, about whom we'll talk a little bit more later, on the work of V. Gordon Child, and then another article in Norwegian, which I couldn't read, by a Norwegian archaeologist about archaeology in Norway under the occupation. And that was it. So I was lucky in that I had access to primary sources and was able to do a lot of initial sort of archival research, and discovered pretty quickly that this was an untapped area, but an also very important one in understanding how the National Socialist sort of propaganda machine had been enabled by the historical disciplines. And archaeology is actually technically a historical discipline, at least in Europe. It's not a social science.
Right. Yeah, it's a little different.
That was kind of that was the starting point. It turned out as well that while the history professions in history, specifically in Germany, had gone through a kind of self-critical self-evaluation after World War II, prehistoric archaeology had not. And my question was why? And so that was sort of the beginning of this quest, I guess you could argue, for trying to understand that symbiotic relationship between archaeology and politics that's exemplified by National Socialist Germany. And it's also, I think, really important to note that that's not a unique relationship, which we'll get into in the course of this interview.
Certainly. And one thing I think that, should be addressed, of course, is the fact that many archaeologists have looked at the fact that one of the issues that we face with interpreting the past with, artifacts and features and the study of archaeology and that scientific process, one of the issues that we face is a lot is very open to interpretation due to the inherent ambiguity. And therefore, it is so important to look at what your work entails as a study of how that interpretation can be incredibly biased and how it can be actually put to work in very destructive ways. And so this is something that really broadly in archaeology, many I've seen have talked about that, and you address some of that in your work as well. Now, you mentioned the term prehistory, and I'd like to also touch on that terminology because in the German prehistory studies movement that was occurring even prior to National Socialism in Germany, there were a lot of factors that were going on, the choice and the use of that term, and also some of the ideology, some of the social issues happening in that time that were influencing that. Maybe we can talk about that, and that would be a good place kind of to introduce the history.
Sure. Well, it's, as I mentioned, it's important to keep in mind that it is, in fact, prehistoric archaeology is a humanistic and not an anthropological or social science discipline in Europe generally, not just in Germany. So that's different from the United States, where because under colonialism, archaeology as a discipline developed as something that was principally engaged in by people of European descent. By definition, they also were not studying their own ancestors when they were looking at prehistoric, kind of remains in North America.
Right.
So the perspective is really different, and something that's referred to as the direct historical approach has always been the norm in European prehistory. And what that refers to, essentially, you have to imagine sort of someone standing in the present, looking over their shoulder at the past, sort of past generations. The idea is an unbroken line. Biological descent is also part of this, not just cultural descent. Going into the past, eventually run out of historical records, and then you become dependent on the archaeological evidence. The further into the deep past you go, the more kind of ambiguous that evidence becomes, and the easier it is to manipulate it in some fashion. So the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that there's a really clear division in European archaeology generally, again, especially in Germany, between classical archaeology and biblical archaeology, which were the high status prestige disciplines, and prehistoric archaeology in Germany, for instance. And before the rise of the Nazis to power, it was really the classical and biblical archaeologists that were considered the sort of real archaeologists. There were folks who were, kind of working on sort of folk-related, specifically regional archaeological excavations, but they didn't have university positions. They weren't provided with funding by the state generally. It was all very local, and it was more along the lines of something like a local historical society might be in the U.S. today, for example. And so that's why when you think of early German archaeologists, you're going to think of somebody like, Heinrich Schliemann, whose excavations at Troy were on this like mega scale, and he had this like international reputation. There's a reason why, it's Turkey and it's not Germany that sort of comes up first in that kind of context. But at the same time, there's no question that the relationship between archaeology and politics is really one based on utility. In other words, the degree to which political regimes are interested in archaeological evidence is in direct proportion to their ability to make use of it in the present. And until the rise of National Socialism, and this is specifically now in the wake of the humiliation of World War I as perceived by Germans in general, there was really little interest on the part of the German state in supporting prehistoric archaeology. After World War I, on the other hand, suddenly it became a major element in this nation-building project. So that's where this prehistory versus early history, kind of division where you start seeing evidence for written sources really first becomes important.
Yeah, and I should add, of course, when we see later, as we'll discuss, that Faustian bargain, as you referred to it, there probably was very little funding for this kind of archaeological work during the Weimar Republic, unlike during National Socialism when archaeologists were encouraged, but to do so with a certain ideology in mind.
Right. So again, this particular kind of dependent relationship is actually always there, of course. I mean, on one level, it's important to just keep in mind archaeology is an expensive thing to engage in. It costs money. You need to have somebody who's funding that. Today, more than 90% of all archaeological research is actually what's referred to as rescue or contract archaeology around the globe. And so it's funded obviously by industry largely and reluctantly very often. So this need for some kind of a funding, kind of relationship with an entity that's supra regional at the national level in the case of state level societies is always going to be there. And I mean, whether the extent of the co-option and manipulation is always the same is going to depend to a large extent on the conditions, the socio-political conditions, of that particular archaeological context. So in Germany, then, the local archaeology that was being conducted, prehistoric archaeology before 1933, was largely, not politically motivated. After 1933, the extent to which it was co-opted really varied a bit. So there were high-profile projects that very definitely were required to kind of toe the line, but there was still an awful lot of local stuff going on where it didn't matter enough, and so it was under the radar. So you have to sort of keep that in mind too. And it's also, I think, important to remember that we're talking about 12 years here, and half of those years Germany was at war. And so oversight was by the state with respect to a lot of these local projects was not anywhere nearly as draconian as it was in the period between 1933 and 1939. So just bearing that in mind.
Sure. And now that we have some of the economic and also some of the immediate history established, perhaps we can shift over into the area of some of the key players who were influential in the ideology that was, again, part and parcel to archaeological work as it occurred under National Socialism. Jason, maybe you can take us in this direction, sir.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we begin to understand archaeology being used as propaganda, for the listeners who may not be as familiar with that, I think it's important to establish that foundational information. Under this new discipline, we see obviously some late 19th century influences on what would become archaeology under the National Socialist state. And one of those influences was the philosopher, writer, and ethnologist Arthur de Gobineau. And so I think his popular work, Essay on the Inequality of Human Races, certainly had a major influence on the National Socialist Party as far as their views and outlooks concerning archaeology. So to what degree and exactly how was that essay used to establish that foundational basis?
Right. So, when you sent me this question, I sort of thought about it for a little bit. It's like, how do I address this? Because in some respects, the influence of he's generally considered kind of a racial philosopher. People like de Gobineau or Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was British-born philosopher who married one of Richard Wagner's daughters and was also a well-known racialist writer. They obviously were sort of underpinning a lot of these ideas, in particular about racial purity and what's generally considered sort of racial hygiene, eugenics, effectively. But the extent to which those ideas influenced the way that prehistoric archaeology was actually conducted varied quite a lot, depending on the practitioner and the particular context again. So most of the influence really of writers like de Gobineau and Chamberlain and another racial sort of philosopher by the name of Hans F.K. Günther, who's not as well known because he wasn't really publishing in English, but was referred to as the Rassenpapst, which is a German translation for the race pope. He was actually, in many respects, more of an influence, I guess, on the German propaganda arm, especially the Rosenberg office, which was more sort of concerned with these sorts of things than maybe the archaeological research arm of the SS Ahnenelbe that was controlled by Heinrich Himmler. So it gets very complicated when you try to assess the degree to which individual writers were or were not influential. I think as a general rule, there's no question, and Günther's a good example of this, that that all of these ideas, eugenic kind of concepts, were informing scholars in physical and biological anthropology, especially at that time in both the UK and the US, by the way, not just in Germany, to a much greater degree than again, initially they were affecting archaeological research. So this notion that, for example, the various European races can be divided into different categories is something we actually also see in the work of a Harvard physical anthropologist by the name of Carlton Kuhn, who wrote something called The Races of Europe, not as well known maybe as these other scholars, but equally influential. And in his research, he was searching for what are considered these ideal types as well. And again, when I was in graduate school, cyclotron, one of these atomic smashing kind of structures that was constructed in the 1960s and then mothballed, was a storage area for the Peabody Museum. And Carlton Kuhn's ideal racial types in the form of facial reconstructions and busts were stored there, bizarrely in this sort of like oval, context of the building. They couldn't bring themselves to throw them away, but they're there as a kind of reminder of the fact that this was something that was also, kind of a notion in the U.S. This idea of dividing races into different sort of categories, pure versus less so.
Right.
And of course, it's the Nordic, so-called Nordic group in terms of the European races that's sort of held up by all of these individuals, Chamberlain, de Gobineau, Günther, and others, as the sort of superior kind of group. And in that sense, the concept of, in German it's called Aufnorden. It's a really difficult thing to translate. It means to literally avoid mixing sort of below and try to mix up, right? So that you're avoiding any kind of adulteration of the bloodline. That was something that was clearly informing all of these scholars to one degree or another. But you look at somebody like U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the United States, who in 1927 wrote this decision that led to the forced sterilization of a woman called Carrie Buck, who was 18 when she gave birth to an infant in the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, and apparently this was the result of a rape. Her mother was also categorized as feeble-minded, as was the baby. And so, Holmes's decision, this is a direct quote, was based on the idea that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, end quote. Okay.
Wow.
And that's kind of, most people are not aware of this. He had, in many respects, a lot of very, kind of admirable and important, influences on U.S. Legal history in particular. But that particular decision is often cited because I think it points to this business of how interconnected these scholars were, whether they're legal scholars, social anthropological scholars, biological anthropological scholars, during the 1920s. U.S., Germany, UK. Eugenics was a general kind of phenomenon at that point, and one that you can't just associate with what's going on in Germany.
I'm so glad you point that out. Yes, because in that period in history, again, it's remarkable to think that in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes, sitting there on the Supreme Court, was advocating eugenicist ideas, and that these were influencing law at the time. But again, that is a part of the history that must be understood in the broader context of this academic area of research.
So, my take on this, I guess, is that when it comes to understanding the role that prehistoric archaeology was playing as a kind of handmaiden for the National Socialist state, what their main contribution was really intended to be was how to justify territorial expansion. There was a racial element to that, in the sense that movement eastward and invading Poland was the first step there, obviously, would displace so-called Slavic peoples, and they were one of the groups, the racial groups in Europe, that were perceived as being inferior to the Nordics, for example, right? So in that sense, there is a connection between the two things. But really, the key thing is to keep in mind here that the National Socialist propaganda machine wasn't really interested in what anthropological or archaeological data actually showed, right? They established certain goals, and then they cherry-picked different academic disciplines to achieve those goals. There's a really excellent book by a woman called Gretchen Schaft, who wrote something effectively, specifically focusing on this question of anthropology as again a kind of underpinning of the propaganda of the Third Reich, and she specifically cites the concept of scientism here, and it's important to keep that in mind too, because that's distinctly different from the scientific process itself, where you're actually setting up hypotheses and testing them and then rejecting them if they don't actually meet, if they can't be shown to correspond to the data. That's the opposite of what the Nazis were doing.
Exactly.
They weren't interested in rejecting hypotheses. They were interested in proving them. And that's what scientism is.
Yes, no test for falsehood can often lead to incorrect conclusions. Indo-Germanic migration was one term that you used in your paper in relation to this. And in addition to trying to rewrite their history, Germans in this period, again, they were, like you said, defending the idea of branching out into other areas. One example that you give has to do with someone else that we haven't talked about, and I bet that Jason was going to bring up. Again, we have Gustav Kossinna, who had argued actually about his claim to Germanic people at an earlier time in Polish territory. You also quote Adolf Hitler himself in the paper, who had said Germans who had survived a northern natural catastrophe and evolved a highly developed culture in southern contexts might account for certain archaeological discoveries in Greece. And so clearly they were looking for what they wanted to find, and they were intent on finding it, weren't they?
Yes, and Kossinna is kind of an interesting figure in a lot of respects because he contributed several really important concepts to archaeological scholarship that were picked up by other, kind of archaeologists subsequently. So it's not, the case that everything he produced necessarily can be rejected out of hand because of the way in which he's now associated with National Socialist propaganda efforts. It's the concept of the culture circle, so-called Kulturkreis, and combined with another idea about sort of settlement archaeology, the settlement archaeological method, so-called. Those two things together are what it still remains as a kind of valuable contribution on the part of Kossinna. But that said, and just to sort of briefly define it, basically the idea is that material culture can be said in some way to map onto certain forms of identity, which is a basic tenet of archaeological interpretation. So, if we talk about the Mississippian culture in North America, let's say, or we talk about the Hallstatt culture in Europe, what we're actually discussing is a similarity in material culture assemblages, not just single artifact types, which was actually more what Kossinna was emphasizing. That allows us to kind of use these assemblages as a heuristic device to understand how particular regions are interacting with each other and how change through time occurs. The problem with this is that we know ethnographically that material culture actually doesn't map neatly onto ethnicity or identity. Okay, so what we're seeing there is not they're patterns that are real, but whether they're meaningful in the way that we choose to make them meaningful in the present is another story. And I think again, we obviously apply the concept today much more carefully, especially with respect to sort of ethnicity and identity, but it remains a sort of solid tenet and not something that most people probably even realize is connected to Gustav Kossinna. It's worth noting too, though, that he was technically the first prehistoric archaeologist to actually be offered a professorship in German archaeology, not, in other words, classical or Near Eastern archaeology. And that was at the University of Berlin in 1902. But significantly, the emphasis wasn't on prehistory there necessarily. It was German archaeology generally. And this was partly because his background was really more in linguistics initially. He came late to archaeology, and the way he viewed cultures and how they were constructed is very similar actually to the way linguists looked at language and how languages evolve and are distributed. So the first professorship in prehistoric archaeology actually wasn't created until 1928. So after World War I, and really just as the National Socialists are beginning to establish themselves, and that's not a coincidence. And that was Gero von Merhart, who took the position at the University of Marburg, specifically again in prehistoric archaeology. So you can track the increased state interest in the utility of the past to the establishment of these professorships and eventually also institutes and museums.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Jason?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically when we're looking at the foundation of this, I think it's important to continue to establish that. Now, Kossinna, he had these, which we previously discussed, he had these cultural diffusion ideas that really influenced Nazi expansionist policies. And now, in your paper, you discussed this one particular occurrence where we see the convergence of prehistory and the politics in 1919 rather, upon the creation of the new Polish state. And in your paper, you describe how Cassina addressed that establishment. And so my question to you is, what was the result of that expansion into that Polish state? And ultimately, how did that work out as far as looking at the theories of expansion by Cassina?
Well, I think he obviously had a vested interest in kind of trying at least to ensure that the borders of Germany post World War I, didn't result in the loss of territory that ultimately obviously did emerge out of the Treaty of Versailles. He was born in Tilsit in East Prussia, what was East Prussia then, it's Russia now. So there was a personal element to this too, actually. And in 1919, he was actually commissioned by nationalist organizations in West Prussia and Upper Silesia, again, Poland and Russia, both benefiting from the Treaty of Versailles. And they specifically asked him to produce publications that could aid the German delegation to Versailles to argue for the retention of these territories. And he produced 2 books specifically for this purpose. One of them was focusing on the Ostmark as a kind of, foundational or ancestral territory for the Germanic people. And the other was the Weichsel area, again, the Weichsel River area. And the same sort of emphasis was placed on territorial claims based on archaeology in that publication. Unfortunately, apparently, whoever the head of the delegation was, and the name escapes me now, was not at all interested in either of these books. They apparently were received by the delegation, but never actually specifically used. Now, whether they would have made any difference to the ultimate outcome and the establishment of the Polish state at the expense, obviously, of the territory that Germany had held before World War I is unknown, obviously. I would say it's unlikely that they would have taken that into consideration, but you never know. But we do know that in 1921, when he published the 3rd edition of the seminal work, German Prehistory, a preeminently nationalist discipline, the foreword explicitly refers to this idea that archaeology should be used to rebuild, as he put it, the internally and externally sort of disintegrated fatherland. So he obviously saw his role as, an archaeologist as directly providing ammunition, quite literally, to the state in order to ensure that territorial claims could be established and maintained. Unsuccessfully in the case of the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles, but still he set sort of the stage for how this culture circle concept was going to be applied by the National Socialists after his death.
Yeah. We touched already briefly on the idea of the Faustian bargain and how throughout your paper you actually refer to a few times the idea that there is, a sort of crisis not only of credibility but also the fact that many were embarrassed after the humiliation in 1918, and they were seeking to find a way to sort of reestablish themselves. And so archaeologists absolutely saw the benefits of funding that would occur under National Socialism. Of course, 8 new chairs in German prehistory that year occurred, the year that Hitler rose to power. But I want to look over now at how official policy affected archaeology, and specifically how party policy, what views were held toward it. In order to explain some of the dynamics of that situation, maybe we should focus on the Ananeb. What were they? What role did they play in the official party attitudes toward archaeology at that time? Okay,
so again, the SS Ahnenelbe, as it's officially referred to, was under the direct control of Heinrich Himmler. The other party organization that was responsible for archaeological research was the Rosenberg office, the Amt Rosenberg, which was under the control of Alfred Rosenberg. There was a power struggle between those two organizations, not only with respect to archaeological research, obviously, which quite frankly was probably not at the top of the list of either of those two individuals,
right.
But for our purposes is obviously important. And in a way, it turned out to be quite useful for the discipline because the plan was to actually establish a single umbrella organization that would streamline and politically, kind of control all archaeological research occurring in Germany and outside it, actually. And because of this competition between Rosenberg and Himmler on the one hand and the two organizations on the other, that never happened. It didn't happen in that 6-year window between 1933 and 1939 when the war broke out. After that, obviously, they had other things to worry about. And so, in a way, it allowed especially the Ahnenerbe archaeologists, and it's worth noting here that eventually that organization, you could argue, wins the competition for various reasons. It's been referred to, in effect, the National Socialist Party has been described as an exercise in social Darwinism, because it was like, one of those vernal pools where the water kind of is evaporating and the tadpoles start eating each other. They were all trying to kind of to gain access to resources, and there were petty rivalries, that kind of thing. None of that obviously, helps with respect to sort of making the party more effective, but it did help in an odd way in protecting archaeological research. The Ahnenerbe archaeologists, by and large, by 1939 at least, were principally trained professionals. That wasn't the case when the organization was first founded. And the sort of initial phase of the Ahnenerbe was very much a manifestation of also the early phase of the Nazi Party, which you could argue was extremely eclectic in its appeal, to marginal groups of all sorts. There was a publication that specifically referred to it as a gas balloon. The idea being that you brought in all of this hot air from various disaffected minorities and marginal, groups, and they would allow the thing to then gradually kind of rise. And once it had achieved a certain elevation, then you didn't need them anymore. And that's what happens with the Ahnenerbe too. So the so-called Germanomaniacs, who are the founding members of that organization, are then jettisoned eventually. And what you were referring to earlier about the sort of ambivalent attitude of especially, kind of some of the top officials, not Himmler, because he was always a kind of gung-ho enthusiast, but certainly Hitler and a number of other party officials toward this, what they saw as really something to be downplayed, the idea that, German prehistory was, if you compared it to Greece and Rome, just not really something that you wanted to advertise. There's no writing. They lack these sort of the checklist for civilizations. They're not building in stone and so on. They were useful until they weren't, and you definitely get a clear sense there of the sort of tension that developed between these organizations as a result. But it's also worth noting that the professional archaeologists at this point were equally concerned with not losing the respect of their colleagues abroad. So they too were happy to get rid of the Germanomaniac element, or at least downplay it whenever possible. And if you look at the official publications, and this is especially true for organizations like the German Archaeological Institute, the DAI, which had a number of, and still has a number of offices outside Germany, in Athens and Rome and so on, they were really not happy about this notion that they were going to be connected with these, lunatics essentially, who had these weird ideas about, creating a neo-pagan Germanic religion and replacing, Christianity in Germany with that, and so on. So there was an awful lot of infighting going on, sort of below the surface as well as overtly. And it's an interesting kind of period, especially when you look at the outcome eventually, which I think, as I say, did actually benefit the field. I know it sounds odd, but I think it really did.
Well, certainly, and we'll get into more of why that was the case in a moment. Albert Speer, of course, had referred to Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century as the standard text of party ideology, at least as how it was seen by the public at that time, but he didn't necessarily endorse Rosenberg and Himmler and some of their ideas. And Jason, of course, has here in the notes an even more famous quote from Hitler himself, which maybe, Jason, you could share with us. It's in your paper, Professor Arnold, and I'd read this elsewhere also, but it illustrates kind of the divergence from here. Hitler had once said that perhaps we will find evidence of Germans all over the place, Greece, wherever else. Mm-hmm. At times, like you point out, he takes a very divergent opinion of the efficacy of archaeological studies under the Reich at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, again, focusing in on that, it's important to understand that even amongst that party, there was dissension. And, it's evident that both Hitler and his architect and armaments minister, Albert Speer, they were both not exactly enthused with the warring parties. And Hitler even went as far as to, speaking about Himmler, says the following, quote, "Why do we call the whole world's attention to the fact that we have no past? It's been enough that the Romans were erecting great buildings when our forefathers were still living in mud huts. Now Himmler is starting to dig up these villages of mud huts and enthusing over every potsherd and stone axe that he finds." So there we see, that's an abbreviated version of the quote, but we see there an obvious disconnect from the care of the archaeology and a more focused on the personalities. So I think that's important, again, because we see that even amongst the party themselves, there is this great dissension.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no doubt that, we can see this admiration on the part of Hitler, on the part of Speer, for various, kind of Mediterranean civilizations, both Greek and Roman, in the architecture, for instance, these neoclassical designs that Speer produced. But also, arguably, this notion that the Third Reich was going to be sort of comparable to the Roman Empire, and in both cases, the sort of the emulation there and the civilizations that they're attempting to sort of to copy are not the prehistoric, kind of cultures that they're ostensibly, kind of directly connected to. They're these Mediterranean cultures, and so it was difficult, I think, within the party to reconcile this notion that prehistoric, kind of Nordic racial purity was somehow connected to the Mediterranean, and still explain why the Mediterranean populations in the present were viewed as inferior. This was the problem. And so that's where that Dorian invasion idea comes in, this notion that you have a replacement of pre-classical dialects and traditions in southern Greece by classical Greek, i.e. Dorian linguistic and cultural traditions. And so, the Peloponnesian society that we see in Homer is very different from the historical Dorians of classical Greece. By coming up with this idea that the Dorians were actually Nordic, Germanic-speaking peoples that migrated south and were then adulterated by intermarriage with these inferior groups in the Mediterranean, that's how they managed to kind of keep themselves connected to this cultural tradition that they're attempting to emulate, while still maintaining that their own, kind of prehistoric origins are worth celebrating. So it was really tortuous reasoning, and obviously it doesn't hold up when you look at the archaeological evidence.
Of course, although there's also the symbolic aspect, where certain aspects of symbolism from the ancient past was being, perhaps we would say, borrowed and appropriated. There are more famous examples, obviously, but perhaps one that we could draw attention to now is the bolt symbol of the SS and its origins, or at least its inspiration, in ancient runes. Correct?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Nazis were nothing if not adept manipulators of visual kind of signals. Yeah. The flag, the red, white, and black, use of those three primary colors. It's actually been shown that red in particular is something that humans respond to kind of neurologically at a distance more effectively than just about any other color. They were doing that entirely consciously. Absolutely. Simple symbols, right? That was the key. Get the sort of, the maximum message across from the minimum amount of kind of detail. The SS rune is actually, ironically enough, it's not based on an ancient rune. Some of the other runes that were used they actually invented that one. The double lightning bolt kind of idea, right? So there's a combination of both invented and actual runic, kind of elements in some of these the sort of iconographic representations that we see the party using. The swastika itself, of course, another one of these things that typically is misunderstood by people. It's seen in prehistory, not only in Germany but in a lot of other contexts, in India, for instance, and again, depending on how you want to interpret it, it's often viewed as a sun symbol and as a symbol of healing, ironically. So having been co-opted now, of course, by the National Socialists, it's a bit difficult frequently to even bring it up in archaeological contexts, contemporary ones. And in Germany, there was an exhibit not that long ago that I was part of where they debated whether or not to put a ceramic vessel which had a swastika on it on display or not, and ultimately chose not to.
Yeah, it's incredible, the lasting effect. And I don't think that particular symbol will ever, quote unquote, be rehabilitated despite its presence throughout antiquity. But it shows us that even, looking back to the ancient past, when we see that there is that symbol is still recognizable today, and I think forever shall be, in the context of what we're discussing here, and hence, the importance of the propagandized element and the way that archaeology and history play a role in that. Now, not everyone agreed, of course, with as far as the various classes of German prehistorians, and Jason, I know that you have a question here about some of the three categories of prehistorians at that time.
Well, yeah, more importantly, we obviously know that as these propaganda initiatives were being ramped up, you had party liners, obviously archaeologists who were willing to go along with that narrative and follow wherever they wanted it to go. I'm more interested in the opposition. So, with every rise to power, with every great powerful leader, there's always an opposition. And within that realm of archaeology, it's no different. So let's talk for a few minutes about those who opposed this new form of German archaeology, and where did they stand in the eventuality of it as far as their careers and their influence?
Yeah, this is a tricky one too, because to be honest, there isn't a tremendous amount of documentary evidence available for obvious reasons about folks who actively were acting to undermine the regime in some way, using their particular kind of platform, again, either in publications or through sort of personal connections. It's worth noting that these three categories of archaeologists that you referred to, so what I call the true believers, then much more sort of that's a group that would have been party members before Hitler comes to power in 1933. Within the party, there's actually a phrase that's used, the March violets. So they spring up in the spring, these flowers that kind of emerge only after Hitler comes to power in March of 1933. Those would be the opportunists, right? The fellow travelers. So the true believers are already party members before 1933. The March violets pop up, and that's the majority, I would suggest, after March of 1933, largely because if you wanted to hold any kind of a state-funded position, which was virtually all the options available for archaeological research at the time, you had to be a party member. You didn't necessarily have to join the Ahnenelbe or the Amt Rosenberg, though. And that's another marker of people who are true believers versus those that are opportunists. The opposition, God, this is going to be there. I can honestly say there's no particular individual. There are some folks like a guy called Unverzagt who claimed after 1945 that they were in fact vocally opposed and had gone on record, kind of trying to, actively reject some of the ideas that were being perpetrated by the regime. But in fact, there's really no good evidence for that. Now, that's not to say there were no active opponents. But what they're engaging in is something referred to as the weapons of the weak. Things like foot dragging or sabotage, where you just slow things down. You don't effectively, carry through certain things, even though you've been asked to do them. Or you do them so badly that in the end, the particular initiative ends up not going anywhere. There's one example that I do know of, but interestingly, we still don't know the identity of this individual. There was a very famous German Jewish archaeologist by the name of Jakobsthal, who was a specialist in Celtic art, and he was in the middle of his magnum opus when he fled to the UK, and ultimately had to try to finish his book at Oxford with the help of a colleague there. Now, of course, English wasn't his first language, so that was a problem. But more significantly, he had to leave all of his visual materials, all his photographs behind. And somebody, one of his students, it's not clear who at that point was obviously an established archaeologist within the Nazi regime, found a way to get images to him, right? And we know this now because of work that's been done in the archives at Oxford. The correspondence between Jakobsthal, and again, this unknown individual, he references as well the fact that this person was doing these things, which would have, if that had come out, that person would have lost their job.
Right.
Okay. I frequently get questions about, whether or not individuals were actively threatened in the sense that they were actually killed for their ideas. And again, there's no evidence for that either. They would have lost their livelihood. Their families would certainly have been, kind of affected in various ways. But we're not talking about a situation like the one that happened in Russia under Stalin, where
right.
he wiped out, a whole generation of archaeologists ultimately. And this again shows you the difference in totalitarian regimes between a system where archaeology is a threat versus one where it can actually be viewed as a handmaiden or something that, kind of potentially can be manipulated to help. So one other instance, and I don't know if this is really an oppositional kind of, thing or not, Lothar Zotz, who was an archaeologist and a documentary filmmaker, one of the first, I think, actually, I don't know how many, earlier archaeological documentary filmmakers are out there. He actually had a fairly high-ranking position in the area known as Moravia, which is part of the Czech Republic today, and managed somehow until right up until the end to avoid becoming a member of either the Rosenberg office or the Ahnenelbe. He obviously thought they were both horrible. So he was willing to go along with the party membership thing up to a point. And there again in the archives, you can see there's actual documentation putting pressure on him to join the Ahnenelbe. Luckily for him, things got politically so difficult there that ultimately he didn't have to decide or make that final decision. So I don't know, is that oppositional? You know what I'm saying? It's also the case that not all of the archaeological publications, especially those that were produced in academic contexts, can really be shown to be tainted politically, either in terms of their interpretation or in terms of the kind of work that's being done.
Right. And an important aspect also of this is, as you had touched on a bit earlier, that there were some aspects of archaeology that didn't necessarily fall victim to all of the ideological imposition at that time. You note in your paper that we have, for instance, those paying lip service perhaps to the introduction and also to the summary at the end, but the archaeological record that is produced in some of the research that was being done, the excavations, did produce some useful information from this period.
Yeah, and I think that's actually important to point out. I mean, these the archaeologists that were already effectively in positions of some influence in 1933 had been trained in the pre-National Socialist era. So if the regime had lasted more than 12 years, we would have been looking at a different situation. But it typically takes about a generation at least for this kind of indoctrination to infiltrate academic schools of thought. So if you compare, for instance, Germany under National Socialism to Spain under Franco, you'll see the kind of distinction pretty clearly there. Unfortunately, I would say once established, ideas like that never really disappear. Mm-hmm. So I use the analogy of latent TB. You appear to be healthy, but if your immune system becomes depressed, and by that I'm now using the analog of a nation state, for any reason, the disease can come roaring back and eventually kills you. So, things like, again, racism, discriminatory thinking in various regimes, including obviously in the U.S. right now, tragically current examples, right, are all instances of that. So it's all of this really goes back to this notion of a usable past and an emphasis on trying to ensure that whatever is being generated by these archaeological projects, it's something that that the political system can either benefit from or that puts the society in question in a good light. And there again, this is by no means something that's unique to Germany. I mean, there's a really classic example. I don't know if you read that particular article where I compare. There's a quote from Newt Gingrich on the occasion of the eventual abandonment of the original plan for the 1995 exhibit at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, which was effectively going to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, which of course, is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the end, they reduced it to the plane with almost no interpretive, kind of associations. And Gingrich's comment, because the original exhibit had obviously had a fair amount of pretty, let's say, painful discussion of what kinds of decisions got made, whether they were the right ones. All these people died. Was that really necessary? All of that was gone. And the rationale, according to Gingrich, was, quote, the American people deserve a history they can be proud of. Now that literally could be translated directly into German, and you could put it in Heinrich Himmler's mouth, because he said exactly the same thing. And for me, as an archaeologist, this is really the key. It's not about being proud of your past. It's about being truthful about it, even if the truth is painful, sometimes maybe especially if it's painful. So, again, the archaeologists during, the 1930s and 1940s in Germany that were sort of walking that tightrope, trying to keep their jobs and still stay true to their particular kind of disciplinary standards, really had an incredibly difficult task. And some of them succeeded in doing it pretty effectively, others not so much.
Yeah, and that is such an important message in all of this. Again, it has often been said, we study the past so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past, but it is so very important that we understand the misuse, the propagandization of information, how this has occurred in the past, and perhaps how we apply our knowledge of those potential concerns as we go forward.
So again, as we're referring back to the past and looking at the honesty of it, if you will, my final question to you today is, in modern times, 2020, how are the people of Germany processing their past? And when this topic is discussed there, is it discussed in the same way that we look at it through a historical view, or is it something more personal?
Yeah. I would say it's mixed, really, in terms of the extent to which prehistoric archaeology in particular has been successful in what the Germans call, I hate this, is one of those compound nouns, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, right? You just use the word processing the past. That's basically what it is, except it's a noun. So it's like, how do you come to grips with the past? I think the most important thing to keep in mind with all of this, and this is definitely true in the German context, is that it's an ongoing process. It's not something that ever really ends. Each generation has to kind of be reminded why they have to, continue to kind of grapple with it. In that sense, the publications that have come out since I published the Antiquity article do actually show progress, significant progress even. I mean, as late as 1992, there was a documentary film I was involved in where one of my colleagues, German colleagues at the University of Freiburg, who had actually been teaching seminars on archaeology in the 1930s and 40s, agreed to be interviewed, and then at the last minute pulled out because he had been leaned on by the administration. I think if that film were to be produced again now, that would not happen. So, it's gotten better, let's put it that way. There's still no comprehensive overview that's been produced. There's a tendency to sort of focus on individual biographies, especially, rather than processes or looking at sort of the fundamental underlying reasons why prehistory was co-opted. So it's a partial success, the sort of processing of the past project in Germany. I think it's also going to be very difficult to keep the current generation kind of interested. It's already clear that there's some pushback, this notion that this wasn't their fault. Why should they have to deal with it? The notion that the guilt is something that gets passed on from one generation to the next is not always accepted by younger people in Germany today. So I think, there's a danger there of reverting to sort of a sense that none of this that's already been dealt with. So we really don't have to continue to kind of, to try to engage with it on some level. So yeah, I would say a mixed record.
I want to thank you again for joining us today here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. Your insights are very, very important right now.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. This was really terrific experience for me.
Dr. Bettina Arnold is, I would say, the authority when it comes to this area in history and the archaeological perspective on that. We want to thank her again for making time to talk with us. I want to thank you, Jason, for lining that up. It was very educative to be able to speak with her and to glean her knowledge. And again, the reminder is ever present. How politics and social movements can sometimes shift a narrative for the worse. And World War II, of course, remains, I think, that example in modern times of how that happens. And so her work aiming at trying to understand all of the nuances of that is so very important.
Yeah, I really do want to thank her for her time. She's one of the most brilliant and eloquent speakers that, we obviously appreciate all of our guests, but her ability to recall and relay this information I just found to be fascinating. And so I just want to thank her for her time and participation. It truly was a pleasure to speak with her.
Yes, it certainly was. Looking forward to, in the future, some additional conversations we'll be having with some fantastic folks. In the next few weeks, Dr. David Carballo of Boston University will be joining us again. We'll also be having a dear friend of the program, and truly, I think, one of the most talented archaeologists that the Seven Ages team has come to know in recent years. He'll be joining us from the road for a check-in, and that's always a pleasure. We'll go ahead and just mention it's Doug Sane, good friend of ours. So lots to look forward to in the coming weeks, and of course, our ongoing adventures, which you can follow online at sevenages.org. And don't forget about our YouTube channel where we've got videos. You can also listen to all the podcasts. James puts together some fantastic imagery to accompany those. All of that and much more can be found online. So we look forward to seeing you out there. And guys, it being the 4th of July, let's go celebrate our independence today by ponying up for one more round over here at the Crosstime Pub. What do you say? Are you with me?
I'm with you.
Yeah, we're the only ones here. So,
and as Jack Burton said in Big Trouble in Little China, may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
That's right. The check is in the mail. All right, ladies and gents. Well, thanks as always for being here with us. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks, and it is the Seven Ages Audio Journal.